So I'm going to talk a little bit today about cannabis research, ethics, and policy, one of these topics that's become very much a hot button topic. I want to have a caveat up front just to make sure they understand I am not arguing that you or any of your friends should use marijuana in any shape or form. I'm sorry about that. You can read into it what you like. Now, the cannabinoid system is a very elaborate one. There are lots and lots of different cannabinoids. The ones that we tend to focus on when we're interested in the medicinal properties of marijuana are the THC system and the CBD system. THC is most familiarly associated with euphoria, that sense of an overwhelming pleasure, whereas CBD is associated with the more therapeutic effects. And medicinal marijuana is usually low THC content, whereas the kind of stuff that people use for a more recreational effect, a more sedative kind of effect, is very much a more high THC kind of version. Now, the endocannabinoid system is involved in things like amelioration of pain, so it's very often used for pain relief, but it also blocks working memory and it enhances appetite. This is why a lot of people feel a sense of the munchies when they use marijuana. Some statistics are relevant here, and the Washington Post recently put out a very interesting set of statistics. And recently, it's been shown that about 55 million American adults currently use marijuana. Now, if you take a look at this, it breaks it down. That 55 million works out to 35 million using marijuana on a monthly basis and 20 million using marijuana on a yearly basis. About 78 million have tried it but don't currently use it, and about 115 million adults have never tried marijuana at all. Now, interestingly, the recreational use of marijuana is kind of split down the middle. About half of Americans, adult Americans, support the recreational use of marijuana. That is, they support legalization of recreational marijuana use, whereas 47%, or just a tiny amount less, oppose the recreational legalization of recreational marijuana use, and then a small percentage, as you'd expect, aren't sure. But interestingly, people who've tried marijuana are much more supportive of the legalization of marijuana for recreational purposes than people who've never tried it. That is, if you have tried marijuana before, you are going to be far more likely to approve the legalization of marijuana than if you've never tried it, suggesting that folks who are opposed to it are opposed to it and have never used it at all, indicating that there's something deep-seated in their opposition to recreational marijuana use. Interestingly, over half of Americans now believe that the use of marijuana is socially acceptable. This, I think, is an important change. Still, though, 42% say that the use of marijuana is not socially acceptable. That's a significant minority, right? Over 40% of the population believe that marijuana use is not something that they approve of. 2%, again, aren't sure. Now, here we get into some perceptions of the risk associated with marijuana, and that's compared to some legally approved kinds of substances. So 70% believe that marijuana is less risky than alcohol. Alcohol, of course, is approved for use in adults over the age of majority, and in this case, in this country, that's over the age of 21, though there are plenty of folks who engage in underage drinking. As you know, or as you may know, the age of majority for drinking is different in other jurisdictions. I grew up in Montreal in Quebec, Canada, where the drinking age is 18. It's 19 in many other Canadian provinces, and of course 21 across the US. 76% of Americans believe that marijuana is less risky than tobacco. Now again, tobacco is permissible for adults to use, that is, adults over the age of 18. And then 2/3 of Americans believe that marijuana is less risky than opiates. Now that to me is the most remarkable finding from the public here, given that right now we're in the midst of what's widely perceived to be an opiate crisis. That is, many folks are engaging in abuse of opiate drugs, and there's a concern that opiates are wildly and widely overprescribed. And there's a very strong sense that they are very dangerous. Nonetheless, still fully 2/3 of Americans believe that marijuana is less risky, but still a third of Americans somehow believe that marijuana is more risky than the use of opiates. So when we try to think about why is it that some people don't use or choose not to use marijuana, only about a quarter of folks who don't use marijuana don't use it because recreationally because it's illegal. 27%. 26% just don't like it. And then we get into smaller percentages of other reasons. So 16% believe it's not healthy, 9% have a concern about work or school, 6% have no interest whatsoever in the use of marijuana, 5% cite family concerns, and then there are 10% who cite other kinds of considerations, whether spelled out or not. Now this is an interesting set of findings here. The fact that only 27% don't use marijuana because it's illegal indicates that the legal status is not what's keeping people from using marijuana, which suggests that if recreational marijuana were approved, we wouldn't see a massive spike in new users of marijuana. We might see some increase, but we wouldn't see massive widespread adoption of something that people just don't use now because it's illegal. As you may know, we've seen an interesting set of changes in the US recently in terms of the adoption of cannabis programs. Federally, marijuana is prohibited for any reason, but states, based on federalism, have the ability to introduce their own legislation to govern marijuana use. The standard approach is to distinguish between marijuana use for medical purposes and marijuana use for recreational purposes. And Arizona, where we're located, has a comprehensive medical marijuana law, which means that marijuana is permissible with access to a card that is given out by an authorized health professional. That card enables a patient to enter a dispensary and access cannabis products for treatment of a medical condition. Typically, that condition is going to be pain. Now, other states, including California, have a adult and medical use law that is regulated, that is much broader. That is, anybody who is an adult can access marijuana both for medical purposes but also for recreational purposes. Colorado is another of our neighbors that has this kind of comprehensive policy allowing any adult to access marijuana for either medical or recreational purposes. There are some states that allow for products with a very low THC content, so typically CBD-based products to be used. Texas is one of those states. And then some states simply don't allow any access to marijuana-based products. Idaho, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas are some of those states. We are expecting to see more and more changes in this picture as time goes on. Though there's still some widespread opposition, even in the states that have approved either medical marijuana or more liberal, that is permissive, attitudes toward marijuana. Nonetheless, the expectation is that over time we'll see a further liberalization, further permissive policies regarding marijuana use in future years. Now, one of the challenges that's really important for us to consider when thinking about both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana legislation is that currently there's an absence of evidence about the safety and efficacy of marijuana for medical purposes. And on top of that, we've got what I call here a suboptimal regulatory regime. And I'm going to go through both of these in some detail in order to give you a sense of what I'm on about here. So the absence of evidence issue is pretty straightforward. Right now, it's crystal clear that there are virtually no clinical trials showing safety and efficacy of marijuana for medical purposes. Now, on the one hand, that could be damning, right? We don't have the evidence that medical marijuana is safe, nor do we have the evidence that medical marijuana is effective for most kinds of indications. Now, there are some exceptions here. Marinol is one drug that's been approved for quite a long time for the treatment of nausea associated with certain kinds of cancer drugs in certain populations of folks who are especially badly off. And there's some evidence now, and there's a recently approved drug for certain rare types of epilepsy in children. And so we've got a CBD-based drug that can be prescribed for those very rare childhood epilepsies. But for the most part, we don't have the clinical studies supporting the safety and the efficacy, that is, the safety, that is, that it's not going to cause harm, and the efficacy, that is, that medical marijuana actually treats the condition in question. So why is that? Well, it turns out it's precisely that we haven't conducted those studies in the first place. It's not as if we've got a wealth of clinical studies that show that medical marijuana is unsafe and ineffective. It's just that we don't have the studies at all. And it turns out that the reason that that's the case is that in the US, at least, the government has made it near impossible to conduct medical marijuana research. And that's because the Drug Enforcement Agency classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Now, the reason it's a Schedule I drug is that there's no evidence of medical benefit, but I call this a research catch-22. There's no evidence of medical benefit precisely because it's a Schedule I drug and so can't easily be studied. In order to study marijuana in a research setting, one needs to have permission from the DEA to conduct the research. And it turns out that it's very, very difficult to secure the kind of clearance necessary to study marijuana in a lab. Now, interestingly, if you take a look at the DEA website, you'll find out what other drugs are classified as Schedule I. Heroin, LSD, ecstasy, methaqualone, and peyote are the other drugs listed as Schedule I. And if you read ahead on that website, you'll learn that Schedule II drugs are drugs with a high potential for abuse, which is similar to Schedule I, and with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence, and they're also considered dangerous. So it's possible that you could classify marijuana in this way if you like, and those drugs include Vicodin, cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone, fentanyl, oxycodone, Adderall, and Ritalin. But you'll notice that at least for Adderall and Ritalin and oxycodone, you've got some medical usages that are widely approved, whereas for marijuana, you don't have that. And because they're Schedule II drugs, it's easier to study these drugs in a clinical setting. Marijuana, by contrast, can't easily be studied in a preclinical or clinical setting. And so we end up, as I said, with this research catch-22 situation. Marijuana can't be studied easily because it's a Schedule I drug, and a Schedule I drug is a drug that has no currently accepted medical use. Until we actually see some changes in the scheduling of marijuana, we're not likely to see any studies that will demonstrate the medical efficacy and the safety profile necessary in order for medical marijuana to be widely deployed according to the typical standards of evidence that are required for evidence-based medicine. So this slide just summarizes that situation. Marijuana is a CSA Schedule I drug because there's no evidence of medical benefit, yet there's no evidence of medical benefit because it's a Scheduled I drug and so cannot easily be studied. And the Marijuana Policy Project that keeps track of these things says gaining FDA approval would likely take at least a decade, a major change in federal policy, and assumes that a privately funded company is willing to spend the tens of millions of dollars necessary to do the research. And they conclude that this is very, very unlikely. I have suggested that this is a kind of Bogarting of the quest for evidence. As it turns out, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is one of the National Institutes of Health, has funded some small studies of marijuana. The NIDA has consistently made it difficult and often nearly impossible for researchers to obtain marijuana for their studies. At present, as the Marijuana Policy Project concludes, it's effectively impossible to do the sort of large-scale, extremely costly trials required for FDA approval. And FDA approval is absolutely necessary in order for a drug to be considered to have evidence of medical benefit. Now, if we are ever to see the kinds of studies that will allow us to classify the medical benefit of medical marijuana, we're going to need to see massive changes in the regulatory regime. Now, there are some regulatory options before us. One is that marijuana could be rescheduled as a Schedule II drug or even a Schedule III drug under the Controlled Substances Act. A second is that we could see an increase in the quality and supply of marijuana available for research. Right now, researchers that do have clearance to conduct research with marijuana need to access that marijuana primarily through the National Center for Natural Products Research at the University of Mississippi. There are some concerns about the quality and the potency of the marijuana produced at the National Center for Natural Products Research. There was a recent clinical study that had been approved here in the Phoenix area for the use of marijuana with veterans experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And a news report that aired on the local networks here indicated that the sample of marijuana that was received from the National Center for Natural Products Research had two issues with it. One of them was that it was moldy, or at least contained mold spores, and therefore was not suitable for use in human patients. And secondly, there was concern that it did not have the kind of potency, that is, it wasn't strong in the way that the kinds of strains of marijuana available at local dispensaries was. And so as a result, there was some concern that we're just setting ourselves up for failure here by requiring the marijuana that's used in federally supported studies to be obtained from the National Center for Natural Products Research at the University of Mississippi. So a second option would be to license other NIDA-approved providers to conduct the growth and procurement of marijuana for research purposes. That marijuana would be potentially purer and more potent and therefore more applicable for human subjects research. But either way, even if we increase the quality and supply of marijuana research, one of the other outstanding issues that we need to have research guidelines in place in order for us to make sure that we're actually satisfying appropriate evidentiary and safety standards with marijuana that could potentially yield the kind of evidence that would warrant the claims that medical marijuana really is in fact safe and efficacious. A second regulatory option would be to decriminalize medical marijuana federally so as to align with those states that have effectively done so. Right now, there is something called the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, which was renewed earlier this year. And with this in place, we've got at least the federal government agreeing not to pursue actions against individuals in the states in which medical marijuana has been approved. But beyond that, Congress would actually have to pass legislation formally preventing the Drug Enforcement Agency and other federal agencies from taking action against those who grow, dispense, and consume cannabis for medical purposes. So a state like Arizona, in which we've got a comprehensive medical marijuana program, would have to be effectively insulated from any kind of federal action in order for medical marijuana to proceed unencumbered by any kind of federal interference, and then we'd have to conduct the kind of research in this state that would demonstrate safety and efficacy of medical marijuana. That said, it's not clear that we're going to actually see the kind of legislative changes that would need to be in place, and even if we did see those legislative changes, it's not clear that we've got the kind of funding that would be necessary, or even the will to fund the kinds of studies that would be necessary to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of medical marijuana. Another possibility is to decriminalize recreational marijuana federally, so as to align with those states like Colorado or California that have a comprehensive adult program for recreational marijuana use as well as for medical marijuana use. So this would require Congress to pass legislation formally preventing the DEA and other federal agencies from taking action against those who grow, dispense, and consume cannabis, period. So here, we'd have to effectively insulate anybody from any kind of legal accountability for growing, selling, or consuming cannabis for whatever purpose. Here we don't have to worry so much about whether the marijuana is safe and efficacious. Instead, what we're worrying about is making sure that people are insulated from any kind of legal action. More generally, what we could do is just legalize the use of marijuana outright. So instead of a decriminalization procedure which insulates people from legal action, what we could instead do is just legalize the use of marijuana for recreational and medicinal purposes. Now, it is the case that some changes may in fact be afoot as we move forward. There was, in August of 2016, there was an announcement that the National Center for Natural Products Research would no longer be the only source of federal weed, that is weed that could be used for research purposes in studies that were approved when somebody had clearance to conduct research with a CSA Schedule I drug. The last time I checked, there hadn't been any licenses granted to other facilities, but at least the groundwork is in place for that to be possible. You may have also noticed that there's been considerable pressure from some interest groups to see a movement toward more acceptability of the use of marijuana, especially in the case of painkilling. And so we've got several groups of that are especially pushing this. So we've got NFL players and especially ex-NFL players, as well as other professional athletes who've been very much, if you like, moving the ball on this. The NFL recently, in the last couple of years, established a settlement and established a fund to pay out to ex-players who had experienced chronic traumatic encephalopathy as a result of the accumulation of multiple concussions throughout their NFL careers. There was a sort of admission of guilt there, perhaps, that the NFL had not done enough to protect the players, but of course there was no official admission of guilt. And a lot of players had argued that had they been able to use marijuana throughout their career rather than the NFL's zero tolerance policy, which has been in place for some time, they might have been able to protect themselves both from the use of painkillers to deal with the pain of any individual concussion and potentially to prevent the onset of chronic traumatic encephalopathy due to the potential neuroprotective effects of cannabis. And it turns out that the US government actually owns a patent on cannabinoids for their neuroprotective effects, potentially against the accumulation of concussions, even though that has been not widely licensed for any further research purposes. Right now, independently of the concussion issue, there are certainly a lot of NFL players who experience significant pain on a weekly basis from playing in a very violent game. The same is also true of NHL players and the hockey players, as well as players in many other professional and amateur sports. And so there's been a push amongst professional athletes to allow for medicinal and even recreational use of marijuana. On top of that, one of the larger, if you like, constituencies that's begun to rally a little bit for the use of medical marijuana is folks who advocate against domestic violence, in part because, again, we've got a massive population of individuals who are experiencing significant pain as a result of battering and who could potentially benefit from the use of marijuana and who would, I think, be very much advocates for either the decriminalization or the legalization of marijuana use. Beyond that, of course, there are folks who are very much concerned about the opioid epidemic and who would love to see marijuana in place in lieu of opioids as the treatment of choice for pain. In February 17, Congress established a bipartisan Congressional Cannabis Caucus to explore issues associated with marijuana, medical, recreational, and otherwise. And when the current administration in Washington took over, there was some initial concern that, and this was when Sean Spicer was the spokesman for the White House, that the president would direct the Department of Justice to enforce federal law regarding marijuana. And Sean Spicer argued very strongly in favor of the president's then stated position on this. There was some widespread outcry that this would be definitely a step backward for the U.S. As you may know, very recently, at the end of October of this year, 2018, we saw in our neighbors to the north an embrace of the recreational use of marijuana in adults, as well as a widespread medical marijuana program. And so the idea that the Americans would be retrenching while the Canadians are embracing marijuana suggests that there could be a showdown about this stuff as we move forward. Now, we've also got a lot of natural experiments in place already, right? We've got in Colorado, in California, and some other states, we've got some widespread recreational marijuana use, as well as in Arizona and other places, medical marijuana programs that also coexist with recreational programs in states like Colorado. So we've got an opportunity to observe what's actually going on in places where recreational and medicinal marijuana use is ongoing. And here we've got access not just to federal weed, but rather to the kind of marijuana strains that have been very carefully raised by and tended by the so-called bud tenders in dispensaries who very much know their stuff. And so we could potentially recruit individuals who use marijuana, either recreationally or medicinally, into studies to observe the effects of the use of these drugs on their outcomes, health outcomes and other outcomes. But these kinds of studies are always going to be suboptimal. We're not going to have control groups. There's going to be a lot of variability in the substance quality and composition. Not all dispensaries are dispensing the same kind of thing. One of the things that became very interesting to me over the years is that I learned that there are some doctors out there who are fully against medical marijuana, but they're happy to advocate for recreational marijuana use. And this struck me as really fascinating. And I started to wonder why. And one doctor told me it's very straightforward for him. And it has to do with this very simple observation. Right now, the situation is that we don't have the kind of evidence base necessary for doctors to prescribe medical marijuana for any condition or just about any condition. That is, the idea that doctors or health professionals are in the business of medical marijuana seems to be in violation of evidence-based medicine. And that is concerning because we want our doctors to be advocating for the best available medicine, and we don't have evidence that medical marijuana is the best or even very good. Now, we have lots of anecdotal evidence that marijuana can be useful, but we just don't have the kind of science-based evidence that's necessary. And we might be better off advocating for recreational use because nobody's really claiming that recreational use solves our medical problems. In fact, by taking doctors out of the game, what we're doing is allowing for people to engage in a kind of self-medication, which we already allow people to do with alcohol and tobacco. Now, granted, alcohol and tobacco use are major public health issues, and recreational marijuana could also become a major public health issue. But we already have appropriate infrastructure in place to deal with those public health issues, and we should allow potentially marijuana to fall into that infrastructure rather than trying to fit it into the medical system in which it's always going to stick out like a sore thumb precisely because we don't have either the evidence base or the will and the money to create the evidence base that would allow for marijuana to be appropriately embedded within evidence-based medicine. So one of the challenges for me is pretty straightforward. Marijuana use of whatever sort, especially where people are experiencing severe health issues, is that they are desperate for something that could work for them. And nothing else appears to work, and this makes them feel better. Anytime we've got a situation of that kind of desperation, this to me calls for some kind of attention, some kind of effort. And the situation for me is pretty straightforward. Right now, I think scientists and clinicians should be redoubling their efforts to conduct exceptionally well justified research with appropriate agents, whatever agents those might be, in whatever model is best for the job, and that might be humans, and then collaborate with ethicists and regulators to make it safe and convenient to do so. This might actually involve advocating for a rescheduling of marijuana so that it could be more appropriately studied within the US system. And so this would enable potentially for us to go the standard FDA route to approve marijuana for medicinal purposes. This is exactly what happened with the CBD-derived therapy for certain rare childhood epilepsies. It's certainly a way to go for some conditions, but it's not going to be a general solution, at least not in the short term, unless we see significant lobbying, advocacy, and major changes in Congress. Alternatively, we might just have to legalize marijuana, period. This would be a significant reduction in the burden of, in the criminal justice system, a significant reduction of sentences and potentially very unfair imprisonments for large sectors of our population, especially poor Black and brown folks, and could allow us to divert resources where they're needed. I don't mean to downplay the potential harmful effects of marijuana, and it certainly is the case that the stronger, more potent forms of marijuana that are available in dispensaries are nothing like the marijuana that, say, our parents used to access. But at the same time, unless we actually get, if you like, pull our head out of the sand and really take a good hard look at marijuana, and given the public support for doing so, I think we're going to end up not actually pursuing a very valid and viable approach to deal with a number of our societal issues today. Now, again, I just want to wrap up with one last caveat. Just because marijuana may not be dangerous does not mean that it is safe. So the evidentiary knife cuts both ways. That we don't have evidence that it works also means that we don't have evidence that it is safe or unsafe. And again, I have not argued that you or your friends should use marijuana in any way, shape, or form. I apologize for that. There's a lot more that needs to be said about this topic, but I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.